Okay, today we're going to talk about how sometimes mythology is based on some fact or truth. I actually did a video maybe 4 years ago now referring to this and portion of the video, and I went through a few different instances of where we had an idea of giant sharks and things like the Kraken and so on like that, but those have been proven to be true nowadays. Most of y'all have seen the giant colossal squids that have been found in ancient times and realize that they're true because they've been found in a modern time. They still exist. It's kind of what sperm whales eat. They're a toothed whale, and so they don't filter feed out krill and things like that, like you think of in the Finding Nemo movie and so on, with their bristle teeth. They are actually an attack creature that has real sharp teeth, much like a killer whale. This is a depiction of a kraken, or supposed a sepia or cuttlefish that was giant, that was reported to French seamen off of Angola's coast who were whalers. It was labeled in this picture as a kraken here in the engraving by Robert Hamilton's MD book. Sepia in former usage included octopus and not just cuttlefish. And what they quite often show here is an octopus type creature. Any of you that have probably watched the Clash of the Titans know about the ancient story of Perseus and how he kills Medusa, and then he uses Medusa's head to turn the Kraken to stone and save the fair maiden. So it's not something that comes from a modern time. It comes from way back. In fact, a lot of these tales were given by Phoenician people who would go out upon the sea, out the Pillars of Hercules, and to many other destinations at the time. In the actual real story that a lot of this was taken from, or an account that was looked at as being somewhat true, but they thought they just exaggerated. There was a tale of an ancient whaling people that it took down the ship like this, like you would think of in Pirates of the Caribbean. But the Kraken was something a little bit different. It really was not an octopus type creature, more of a giant squid. And so whenever they had this giant squid, it was always looked at as a myth. But nowadays we've seen some of those, and hopefully if I've got some room at the end of the video, I'll show you a recent footage of divers diving with one that was on its way out at the surface. But the Kraken has been given many depictions like this, but most people know about whaling. And whenever they would go whaling, they wouldn't use this ship to try to attack the whale with. They would use the small ships that they have on the side of it, which is really something like the little people carriers they had on the Titanic. It wasn't the Titanic that was doing it, it was the smaller ship. And so it's believed that there was a conflagration of the concept that whenever they went after these whales, they eventually got attacked by a still alive Kraken or giant cuttlefish, and that it even took down the ship, and in doing so spawned forth a lot of ideas on this Kraken, if you will, a thing that we know is totally true. Depictions like this are used in like the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, where they can call upon the Kraken just by making a pounding noise and so on. But this wasn't what happened actually in the original story. It was the small whaling ship that they used to use to harpoon him with, and then ride the whales to the point that they would succumb eventually to it, and they would get the whale from there. When I was in 5th grade, I was asked to give a book report on something, or something from mythology, or along that line. And so I looked into whales, because at that time I had just seen the movie Clash of the Titans, if you're familiar with the old version of it, and where it showed it there. And of course I was already into mythology and things like that. And so I looked up whaling to try to make a connection there. And in Collier's old encyclopedia, it's a version of encyclopedias that were out. They had, in the whaling portion of the book, or of the encyclopedias, they had a picture of a sperm whale that had been captured, killed, and then drug all the way back to land here. And in doing so, they were filleting the thing open and getting the whale oil and stuff like that. But what struck me as extremely odd was that there were sucker marks all down the side of this whale, some of them about baseball sized, slowly getting larger, coming towards its head, where they were bigger than a basketball. And that would have to be a squid that was just giant. Whenever I showed that to the teacher, she said, you know, you might have something here, something that people think is just mythology, but it might be true. And I got an A on it. I thought that was fantastic. A crake is a top of a tree where it has a main mast and then other sticks that are off of it, and people used to use these as anchors. And they say that that's probably the root for naming these ancient creatures, because they had a body like that and a bunch of arms coming off of it and so on. And of course people became familiar with tidal octopuses and so on, but nobody could believe that there was a giant octopus or a giant squid. They just always saw the smaller versions of them and then wanted to believe, you know, but people got gigantism and got over 11 foot tall or whatever from people who had a pituitary gland problem. And that almost seemed impossible if that's what it was. But then again, there's actually different species of those, like the Humboldt squid that's over 3 foot long, almost 4. They've been known to attack divers and bite them and all kinds of things. So it kind of shows you some truth in that. Although a lot of this was always looked as mythology, because the ancient Phoenicians used to draw depictions of places they didn't want anybody to go, of dragons in the water and weird things that look like this. And so these are versions of Leviathan that's in your Bible. Yes, there's sea monsters in your Bible, and it tells you that Yahweh killed it and so on too. A lot of things people don't really realize about the Bible is there's a lot of mythology in there, and a lot of stories that really don't make any sense until you understand that it was all mythology. Like there's a talking donkey in the Bible. And of course it starts out with a woman that grew from a rib and ate from a magic tree because a talking snake told her to. Some people can't fathom that that's mythology, talking creatures. But there's other things like the Medusa starfish here that has a bunch of legs coming off of it, and that gave that idea. And of course they had ancient ones that were put into alcohol and saved so people could see something like this, but they didn't see anything that was really that giant. There were appearances of these things with 90-foot whaling ships saying that it could be 200 feet long. I think a lot of that is exaggeration. We find the colossal squid and the giant squid are probably going to be somewhere around 90 feet, but they said it was much bigger than the ship. And a lot of these stories said that they were much bigger than the ship, but in reality, they were much bigger than the small whaling ship that they used out on the water. not the big giant ship that they put the little ships on that they did harpoon the whales with. So here we see a depiction of whaling and describing this giant thing that was there. And of course, there's all kinds of things brought about by other stories. And again, here's a giant squid type of creature that's known as the Kraken. And we're all familiar with this, especially if you've seen the modern depictions in Pirates of the Caribbean. But a lot of these stories of ancient sea creatures were just ancient Phoenicians telling you where not to go and so on like that. That if you go here, there are creatures and they'll be killing you. They'll kill you off. They'll take your ship. They'll do whatever. Now, this is kind of just like dragons that I did a bunch of other videos about too, because if you went out the Pillar of Hercules out of the Mediterranean and tried to go anywhere, you would run into Phoenicians that would act like pirates and take your ship and or burn it and send it to Davy Jones' locker along with yourself. It wasn't allowed at one period of time. But that's for a total other video, but I've spoken about it before. But all these giant crayfish, giant lobsters, things like that, they show where they were taking and dragging a man from a ship and all these type of things are looked at as being all farcical type tales. There's even tales of in the Bible where they actually rode on the back of a giant Leviathan. It could end up putting the ship on top of it. Looks like a giant goldfish with a shark's mouth onto it with a fringe around its head. Looks like a lion and two spouts, not just one. Well, a lot of whales do have a double spout. But here in these islands, there, if you'll look, this is right outside the Pillars of Hercules. For that's Mount Atlas there in the bottom right-hand corner. Barbaria, Gadez, Hispania, and so on. And this is something that was taken as truth and reality for people for thousands of generations, or hundreds of generations, if you will. This is more akin to the real thing that happened. Of course, a modern artistic depiction of a giant squid attacking two fishermen. And you can see how big the squid is right there. So whenever Neptune, i.e. my namesake, unleashed the Kraken, that's what it had to do with. This is where the story comes from. You can tell that's a squid. And a lot of other fanciful tales are taken from this. Here's an illustration from the original 1870 edition of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne. And many people remember seeing that. And it's robotic type depiction of a giant squid that was in that also. But let's look at a modern form and where we can see there actually was a Kraken found.
Anyone with $10,000 or more in credit card debt or personal loans may qualify for help from National Debt Relief. Minimum payments could literally keep you in debt for decades. $10,000 in debt.
So you can see this giant one here, and you can see the divers going around it. Now this one here is only some 35 foot long, but this is the Kraken, albeit not as giant as the ones of the story. And of course, things can get embellished over time, just like ancient fish stories. But in reality, this is something very much like the Kraken that we heard about from before. So when people say there's some truth and reality to mythology, there definitely